I'll give a intro. Let me make sure that everything's fine here. It's being a little slow. Oh, that's why it's like that. Okay. All right. So people are gonna trickle in just like a couple as the time passes on, but we can get started now since it's 4 o'clock. All right, welcome everyone to Frank Analysis. I'm your host, Franco. I am joined today by a special guest, Robert Inlakesh. He is a journalist, writer, and political analyst of The Last American Vagabond. He has lived and reported from the occupied Palestinian West Bank. His focus is on the Middle East, particularly Israel Palestine. He also has a documentary called the Steal of the Century. Robert, thank you so much for being here. How are you doing, man?
Thanks for having me, man. And no, it's good to speak to you.
So let's start with what motivated you to start the work that you do. Why did you decide to be a journalist, and what interested you so much about the Middle East and Israel Palestine in particular?
Well, to begin with, I mean, it's a long story to where I came to today. I've lived in many different countries, and during the course of growing up, essentially, I had found out that we've been lied to about a lot of the foreign policy mistakes that we've gotten into, if you can call them mistakes, that is. And I started investigating things. Really, the Iraq War was number one for me. And from there, starting to ask questions. This was back when I was in high school, starting to ask questions. And then the responses I would get would just be, I'd be met with complete anger. People would not meet me rationally halfway or trying to explain things to me. And that only inspired me and a friend of mine to dig deeper into events, um, and I suppose from there, I started getting into other issues. I started reading a lot about the history of specifically the Middle East, and that, of course, brought me to Israel Palestine. To cut a long story short, eventually I went over to Occupy Palestine. I lived there. And I witnessed the crimes firsthand. And of course, I'm friends with lots of Palestinians. And so living there, witnessing what was happening to my friends, and living in Palestinian households whilst I was there, motivated me really to become a journalist more than just an activist like I formerly was, because I felt there was a need for more people to talk about this. And I saw that the mainstream press was not doing its job, and that so many of these stories which were coming out of occupied Palestine, including things I'd seen headlines about events which had happened in villages near where I was staying in a village called Bilain for a long period of my stay in Palestine. And ultimately, I decided that this, like I need to be part of this. I need to be talking about this, and I can't close my mouth. Like I can't shut up. And from
Mm-hmm.
there, I started writing, and eventually, it developed, and I was appearing in all different places. I was able to work with a lot of other journalists, and I was able to um, get a job with Press TV as well, and other outlets, Palestinian media outlets, Syrian outlets, etc., and develop myself as a journalist when normally my interest before this was in history, and not specifically journalism, and it was more like of an activist-based thing that I had. But yeah, growing up throughout the years and watching how we've been lied to sort of motivated me to get on the path. I mean, that's sort of a little bit of a explanation of what happened. There was obviously a long period which I went through learning different things. I was living in all different countries, including China, and living inside of China as well opened up my eyes to many things which I hadn't witnessed before, and meeting a lot of different people, which brought my attention to different issues. So it was a long journey to where I am today. But ultimately, it's the thing that drives me and motivates me, is, trying to cover as accurately as possible what is happening inside, specifically the Middle East, but the global South, and of course, standing up for people's basic rights, because all over the world that people are being deeply deprived of them.
So your documentary is called "The Steal of the Century," which is a play on the words that Trump and Bibi Netanyahu used to call the peace deal between Israel and Muslim countries to recognize it as a state. They call it the deal of the century, but there's more to it, which is why the Palestinians are against this. Many other Arabs and other countries are also against this. Part of the deal involves further annexation of the Palestinian land. So could you tell us a little bit more about your documentary and what it explains to the audience about what's happening in Palestine?
So my documentary is one that I went over to Occupy Palestine pretty much just after the deal was officially announced. That's the latter part of the deal, the so-called political solution. And I decided to go back to Palestine. I met up with a friend of mine and a journalist, a well-known journalist, Hamdi Abu Rahma, and we decided to basically travel around the occupied territories, speak to people about how this plan would affect them, and bring the Palestinian side of the story to people. And also inside of the documentary, you'll get a rundown of the history of the conflict. And in general, I wanted to show the Palestinian side and why Palestinians were so opposed to this. Because on the media, you might hear that the Palestinian Authority, for instance, rejected it, that Hamas rejected it, and that Palestinians aren't too happy about this, and there's some protests. But they will not go into depth. They will not tell you, for instance, that this deal does not grant a Palestinian state. It doesn't. It will essentially isolate Palestinians into living in these isolated islands or Bantustans. They will not have the ability to have a real border. They will not have the ability to have armed forces. Wow. They don't have even control over what they will teach their children in school. So in this documentary, I interview lots of Palestinian activists, journalists, members of the Palestinian Authority, and I get their take on this and what they they felt towards this deal. Also, we go and we investigate, for instance, what happened just afterwards in terms of the demonstrations which were going on, the murder of Palestinians who participated in these demonstrations. And we filmed a lot of content, and there was so much there that a lot of the stuff that we filmed didn't get put into the documentary. But the documentary itself, the series, there's 2 of them, give you a good overview, a good outline of what the deal of the century meant for Palestinians, what happened on the ground immediately after that. The deal of the century is essentially explained in this. And there's many different moving parts to it, so it's extremely hard to cover every single aspect of it. But I try to lump in everything, of course, speak from the perspective of international law, and also Palestinians on the ground there and what they had said to me, their sentiments, and of course use their voices.
So how long were you in the Palestinian West Bank, and can you tell us a little bit more about the experience there? Like, what kind of hardships did you witness the Palestinian people face?
Well, I've been there quite a few times. So the first time that I went there, I was there for 3 months, and that was a huge eye-opener to me. In terms of, I knew a bit about the conflict already. I'd read a lot about it. I'd heard a lot about it. But when I went there and I was invited to stay with a friend of mine, when I actually went there on the ground, the first day I was there, I experienced the blatant racism of the Israelis towards Palestinians. I had a gun pointed at my head the first day. The second day I was tear gassed. So it was really a shock to see what it's actually like on the ground with your own eyes. And that includes, of course, that, for instance, so the undivided capital, as they call it, Jerusalem, for Israel's undivided capital, they tell us, is cut up by an apartheid wall. East Jerusalem is still under international law considered an occupied territory, and the people there are being constantly displaced. So you will see in East Jerusalem that there are constant bulldozings of houses there. It is almost impossible to get a permit to build a house there. There's an ongoing ethnic cleansing campaign which is being carried out, and specifically this year as well, if you look at it, but this past year behind us, in fact, if you look at it, these are some of the worst statistics in terms of Palestinians being forcibly removed from their homes and made homeless in East Jerusalem on record. And so just that in of itself, I remember the first day I arrived in occupied Palestine, I was on my way to Ramallah, and I had taken a bus from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem. And when I got to Jerusalem, I was in an Israeli bus station, and I was trying to get to what's known as the Arab bus stop, which is near the Damascus Gate inside of Jerusalem. And so I was asking all of these Israelis, I went to the directory sort of box, and I was asking them, how do I get to the Arab bus stop? And suddenly I found myself surrounded by about 15 people, half of them in military overalls, who were asking me, why do you want to know about these people? Oh, you want to go there? Laughing and saying things in Hebrew, and I couldn't understand. And then I went back to the person who was in the box, right, to ask him, okay, like how do I get to the Arab bus stop? How do I go to Ramallah? And he's like, you don't want to go there. And I'm like, yeah, I do want to go there. Like, how do I get there? He wouldn't tell me. Eventually, an Israeli taxi driver had come up to me because he saw that I was trying to get to this place I was telling him. And he said, come with me, I'll take you there. I was walking outside with him, and as I was walking down to his taxi, he was telling me, no, I'll take you to the checkpoint to get into the West Bank. You don't go on the Arab bus, because if you go on the Arab bus, they're going to steal your luggage and they might kidnap you and they might stab you. And I said, I don't think that's going to happen. And by the way, I've used this Arab bus system to go inside of the West Bank from Jerusalem many times after that I used it. And there was never a problem. Always the people very courteous, very nice to me, even under the stress of having to go for these militarized checkpoints on the way as well. But this guy was adamant that I was going to be stabbed, I was going to be robbed, and essentially the way he was portraying these people that they were terrorists. I ended up getting to the other side of the checkpoint eventually, of course. But this is one of those stories where you get there and instantly you're hit in the face with the racism. It's something like I had never experienced such open, brazen racism in terms of like how they don't even, there's no hiding it. I'm just asking to go to a certain place, and I was hit with this on my first day. Then when you get inside of the occupied territories officially, it's a whole other ballgame. And what you're seeing there with your own eyes, it's hard to understand why it is the mainstream press, with its wide and its vast range of resources that it has, why it cannot just go and report on what is occurring there on a daily basis. Even when it comes to settlements and the issue of settler violence, which I have witnessed, it's like a complete blackout what the settlements actually are, how they expand onto Palestinian land. It's not explained properly. These are entire cities. And that was extremely shocking for me. Many of my friends, since I've first gone there, including the children of my friends, have been put in military prisons, many in administrative detention, which means held without a charge. They've been badly beaten up, tortured. A lot of my friends have been shot with rubber bullets, tear gas canisters. In fact, one of my friends was shot through the leg and almost bled out and died. I witnessed several arrests, the brutalization of Palestinian women, the ripping of hijabs off of Palestinian women, settler attacks, you name it. I was shot at by Israeli forces in protests as well that I attended. And so when you go there, if you spend enough time, you go to the right places where the protests are happening, where the settler violence is. In Al Khalil, for instance, I would recommend if anyone's going to go to Palestine, go to Al Khalil, or it's known as Hebron. Go there and you will witness firsthand what's happening, and it's shocking. It honestly is shocking.
Yeah, based off of what you're telling me and what I saw from your documentary, also from what I've read from like other journalists like Max Blumenthal or heard from Richard Medhurst, what is happening in Israel is akin to apartheid South Africa. In your documentary, you were telling an Israeli soldier about how what they are doing to Palestinians in their own land is racism, and just like what South Africa did as an apartheid state. And then the soldier told you that he said no one really cares. So could you tell us more about the similarities that you see in Israel and apartheid South Africa?
Well, there's plenty of similarities that you can spot between the two of them. Of course, they are succinctly different systems. However, they do share a lot of similarities in terms of the deprivation of people of basic services, for instance. You can just observe Palestinians, how they live compared to how the settlers live. For instance, you can look at the lack of water resources there. You can look at the road systems, which are segregated. And there's many different things inside of the West Bank which you can compare. The brutal crackdown on Palestinian protesters could be compared to how they cracked down on the South African protesters. The resistance, how it formed as well to the settler colonial rule, is a very similar thing as well. And I think it's widely agreed upon that there is a direct comparison there, that the systems put in place are very similar in the occupied territories to that of what was put in place inside of apartheid South Africa. And leaders like Desmond Tutu would, of course, say this as well. And have said this and put on record, and many of the prominent South African figures have linked the two issues. Of course, Nelson Mandela was aligned with Yasser Arafat during the time of the PLO. And its resistance against its guerrilla warfare resistance, and then later on, of course, adapting into the Oslo Accords and turning the PLO into the PA. And so it's similar in that it's a similar system to, for instance, if you're going to link it to how Australia was invented, right? Or how America came to be as well. These are very similar systems. They don't change over time. They do the exact same thing. And it's a very similar situation to if you were to compare it to what was happening inside of Algeria as well with the French settlers that were there. And so when we're looking at this issue, I think the most important thing when we're looking at apartheid as an issue, and we know that B'Tselem, just the leading Israeli human rights group, labeled it an apartheid regime. That report just emerged this week, and they said it's not a democracy, it's an apartheid regime. That's Israel's top human rights organization. That's not just me saying this. You know, this is not hearsay. This is not me using glorified language. There is a direct link between the two. And of course, apartheid was originally known and originally used for the South African system. But later on, the United Nations came to confirm that apartheid can also be applied as a term to other systems of injustice. And if we look at the roots of, obviously, I don't have the definitions up right now, but if we look at the root definition of it, it is basically depriving a population, a certain population, based upon them being of a certain ethnicity, goods and services, and keeping them underneath the other population, the settler population, in this case. So it's inextricably linked to South Africa and what was going on there, and it has been throughout the history of global South unity and resistance. These two issues have been linked. And of course, it is linked with other struggles like the struggle in Algeria for liberation from the French. And it is linked also, if you want to look at it back in the day in terms of how the United States or Canada or Australia were created. It's a very similar thing. It's settler colonialism. The settlers come in and displace the native population. And yes, if you were to look at the South African system, that's one of those systems which you could say most lately collapsed, which installed apartheid.
Yeah, it's like we're witnessing ethnic cleansing happening to the Palestinian people, much like what the United States and all these other Western European countries did to other lands that they colonized. So Donald Trump, he claimed that he was going to be an anti-war president. However, his actions show that he was anything but. Although he didn't create any new wars, he did increase drone strikes to the already massive amount that we were launching under Barack Obama. Barack Obama, who was nicknamed Bomber in Chief. He also got us into war with Iran, almost got us into war with Iran by assassinating Iranian General Qasem Soleimani. A big reason for Trump's horrible record on foreign policy is because of his pro-Israeli agenda and people he put in his administration who were very pro-Israel, like Secretary of State Mike Pompeo, who we were just discussing before the show. What would you say are some of the major highlights of Trump's foreign policy and how it affected Palestinians?
If we're looking at what he's done to the Palestinian people, there is such a large record that we can go into. I mean, first of all, his recognition of Jerusalem as being the capital of Israel, hence moving later on. He did that in 2017 in December. The next year, he moved the embassy, the U.S. embassy, into Jerusalem. And on the very same day, 60 plus unarmed Palestinians were gunned down in Gaza for protesting in what was known as the Great Return March. And the Great Return March, which happened during the Trump years, by the way, which Donald Trump did absolutely nothing but protect Israel when this happened, was one of the largest nonviolent demonstration movements which has ever occurred in terms of percentage of the Gazan population which actually attended this thing. And in the course of this, around 330 Palestinians were exterminated, essentially. Mm-hmm. They were exterminated. And around 35,000 of them were injured. This is in around a year and a half. This is what happened to the Palestinian people in Gaza. Of course, the Gaza Strip was bombarded a number of times. There were high-level assassinations of Palestinian political figures inside of the Gaza Strip. Again, Trump providing aid all throughout this. On top of that, we could look at Trump's move to defund organizations like UNRWA, that's the UN agency set up for Palestinian refugees, which was founded in 1949 after the ethnic cleansing of Palestine between 1947 to 1949, when approximately between 750 to 850,000 Palestinians were pushed out of their homes. This organization was primarily financed by the United States. When the United States withdrew its funds from UNRWA, this had essentially meant that for around 28,000 Palestinian employees with UNRWA, that they would not receive their salaries, and they haven't received their salaries in full. We heard the latest developments of that, the announcement by UNRWA in November of last year, when they were saying that. That's a huge effect that it's had. And that issue, just to stay on that, when it comes to UNRWA, the reason why there has been such a great defunding of this is because it registers and it will allow for around 5 million Palestinian refugees, whether they be living in the Gaza Strip. There's 2 million people there, and 70% of that population are the descendants of refugees or refugees directly that were expelled. And are classified as refugees as they live in refugee camps. For people as well, it provides for people inside of the West Bank, people in Jordan, people in Syria, people in Lebanon living inside of refugee camps. And so taking away UNRWA, defunding it, attacking it, as we've seen Mike Pompeo, U.S. Secretary of State, do to the very last day, essentially. He's been every other day attacking UNRWA on Twitter and claiming that it is illegitimate. This is not just going to mean that hundreds of thousands of Palestinians will literally, in some cases, actually starve, and that people will lose their jobs, that the financing of many different organizations inside of the Gaza Strip, many different programs, social programs, this will dissipate and that there won't be them anymore. And in other areas as well, not just in Gaza. But the number one reason for this and this attack is to destroy the Palestinian refugee issue. And they have consistently attacked the Trump administration, the Palestinian right of return, the legitimacy of the right of return, the legitimacy of UNRWA is the way to do that. because you kill the international registry of those Palestinian refugees. And then you say, well, yes, there's UN General Assembly Resolution 194, which grants right of return. Yeah, Amnesty International and Human Rights Watch, top human rights organizations, they say that there's a right of return. But where are these refugees? So if UNRWA is gone, where are they? Because there's no registry of them anymore, and they will pass it on to another UN body, the UN HCR, which is basically an organization within the UN which works on repatriation, resettlement of refugees, and will not deal with the Palestinians, it is hoped anyway, by Israel, the United States. And of course, the United Arab Emirates has been allegedly accused of being involved in this, will not register them as refugees, will treat them as people that need to be resettled inside of areas like Jordan, like Syria, and like Lebanon. And so this in of itself is denying the Palestinians their right to their own identity as Palestinians, and denying that they're even refugees, despite the fact that they live in refugee camps, right? And that the UN has legitimately has them registered as refugees. And this, in of itself, is one of the biggest racist attacks of the Trump administration, which we have not seen reported. This is, for instance, they go on about, well, you'll deny the rights of Israel to exist, and they'll conflate that with anti-Semitism. You're an anti-Semite if you deny Israel's right to exist, right? And they'll say that all the time, and we hear that all the time. However, right now, not only does Palestine as a state not exist, not only is the United States actively working to make sure and put a plan forth so that Palestine would not exist, but it is also trying to deny the Palestinian people of their identity as Palestinians, and tell them that Palestinians, millions of them, that live in places like Syria and Lebanon and Jordan, should give up their identity, and they're just Arabs. They're just Arabs. They should integrate into those countries and stay there. So that's one of the biggest issues there. Obviously, we've had the United States Trump administration say that settlements aren't illegal anymore. We've had the U.S. Trump administration, of course, allow for Netanyahu to deliver on his campaign promise of annexing the West Bank. That didn't actually happen because Netanyahu was scared of doing it. But the Trump administration allowed for that to happen if Netanyahu did want to go ahead with it. We've also seen the recognition of the Syrian Golan or Golan Heights as Israeli territory by the Trump administration. And of course, kicking the Palestinian Authority out of its office in Washington, D.C. So there could not even be any sort of talks which could go on with them, defunding the Palestinian Authority as well. So the attacks that have been committed against the Palestinian people, and that's just a few of them, I'm just outlining some there, have been horrific. Under the Trump administration, there's never been a U.S. administration that has been this pro-Israel and this anti-Palestinian, and it's racist. That's what everyone has to understand. We point out Trump's racism wherever else it is, but here we don't want to talk about it. We don't want to talk about how incredibly racist the moves that Trump made were.
Yeah, the racism that the U.S. does to other countries needs to be pointed out more to the American people. We need to get the American people to care more about foreign policy because, it's a reflection of what's done here to us too. And as far as my understanding of the peace deals, in addition to the consumption of more land from Palestine, like moving the U.S. embassy from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem, is that the U.S. is trying to force other nations to sign on to it. They already had the backing of the UAE and Bahrain, but they were also trying to force Sudan and Morocco to normalize its relationships with Israel. When these countries don't play ball with what the U.S. empire wants, the U.S. usually blacklists them, sanctions them, overthrows their leaders, etc., until they do what the U.S. wants them to do. So can you tell us a little bit more about about that and how the U.S. and Western powers are trying to force other countries to normalize their relationships with Israel? I remember you had a video explaining Morocco and how the U.S. is trying to get Morocco to normalize its relationships with Israel, as well as Sudan. and also about how these peace deals are actually war deals.
Mhm. Definitely, when we look at the case of Morocco, it is a war deal. It's not a peace deal. There's a long history there with Morocco. In terms of the normalization deals, and this is what the Arab world calls them, normalization. They don't call them peace deals because they don't see them as peace deals, and they understand that these countries for a long time have had, other than Sudan, you can say that Sudan had, for instance, helped get weapons to Palestinian resistance and stuff like this. So Sudan, you can't exactly say that Sudan was always best friends with Israel. However, these other countries like Bahrain, for instance, and the United Arab Emirates and Morocco, these countries have been friends with Israel for a long time under the table. However, when it comes to the full normalization, in the case of Bahrain, Bahrain is essentially under the thumb of Saudi Arabia, and its dictatorship, which rules Bahrain, is a pro-Western dictatorship, which was essentially installed by the British. And so the Bahraini people don't have any say. They feel like they are also under a foreign occupation. And so what happened there, in my eyes, is Saudi Arabia essentially allowing other Arab countries to do the normalization before itself, because Saudi Arabia wants to present itself as, one of the leaders of the Sunni Muslim world. And if you're normalizing with Israel and helping in its oppression of the Palestinian people openly, then that presents a problem for you and your image and everything else. So I believe that would have been Saudi pressure there with Bahrain. The United Arab Emirates is a different one, however, and it helps the United States, and it has helped it in the Morocco and the Sudan so-called peace deals. The United Arab Emirates for some time has been essentially like a second Israel inside of the Middle East for the United States. It has a vast intelligence apparatus. It does have a pretty up-to-date military as well. And of course, it is getting advancements from signing this normalization deal. It's had a long-term relationship with the Israelis as well on top of this. And so it was only within its own interests to grant this deal. Also, if we look at the population of the United Arab Emirates, it's the majority of the people living there are foreigners who are there, basically many of them to be used as essentially slaves, and they're foreign workers. So it's not a country like, for instance, even Bahrain, which is a country which really is made up primarily of its native inhabitants. But in the case of the United Arab Emirates and its vast intelligence apparatus and its ability to mess in the affairs of other countries, we've seen that on display inside of Sudan now more than ever. When it was leading up to this so-called peace deal, the United Arab Emirates' influence over the Sudanese government, or it's not essentially a government, it's transitional period government, the military wing of it, is essentially under the thumb of the United Arab Emirates. And so, of course, when it comes to getting them off a blacklist and all the rest of that, the UAE, its puppets are going to fall in line. The civilian side of that regime is not so much in line with it when we're looking at Sudan. And again, with Sudan, the United States pressured them with taking them in terms of offering them to take them off of the state sponsors of terrorism list. And that would mean that they'd be able to create more capital. And essentially, it's the United States. It's a blackmail tactic by saying, well, more of your people can die of starvation, for instance, in some cases, and your country can get poorer, or you can have massive investment and you can normalize with Israel. And for Sudan, in such a weak position, the military side of the regime accepted it. In the case of Morocco, we've seen that the issue that they got Morocco on is the issue of Western Sahara. Now, the Western Sahara essentially is, according to many, they would say it's occupied territory. Officially, it's disputed territory, according to the United Nations. And there is a national liberation movement of the Sahrawi people of Western Sahara, which is so that people understand. Technically, it's at the bottom of Morocco. Morocco claims it as its own territory. And this territory was or is pronounced to be belonging to the Sahrawi people, according to what is known as the Polisario Front, its national liberation movement. And that is backed by Algeria. Algeria, of course, is bordering Morocco. And so this conflict, which has been going on for some time, not to go into the entirety of the history of it, this conflict, which has been going on, was actually sparked recently again. And lo and behold, the United Arab Emirates is heavily involved in that as well, and likely utilized by the United States. After a long time not having any relations with Morocco, suddenly the United Arab Emirates becomes friends with Morocco, and places the first ever Arab country's consulate inside of Western Sahara, and then uses its fighter jets to aid the Moroccans. And then suddenly the United States offers them this, says to them, we'll recognize your sovereignty over Western Sahara, just as it's coming to the brink of a war. And this peace deal, this truce which was signed, this long-standing truce, was just broken down coincidentally at this time, and the Polisario Front had just declared war on Morocco. So essentially this situation, if it does develop as a result of this, if the situation does develop and the Polisario Front attempts to open up a large-scale war against Morocco, Algeria could get dragged into this. This is why I called it a war deal, because it opens up the possibility for this, and it makes it worse. So in terms of that, that's another blackmail tactic. Of course, there is huge investment which comes with normalizing ties with Israel as well. But above and beyond all, I believe that when it comes to this, in all honesty, it is the Palestinian Authority which essentially, due to it receiving U.S. funds over the years, including funds to attempt a coup on Hamas in the Gaza Strip, which has opened the door for this sort of thing to happen, because the Palestinian Authority no longer commands any sort of political power the way it used to. Arab countries used to align with the Palestinian Liberation Organization. In the days of Yasser Arafat, before Oslo, the Palestinian cause was one which the Arab world was essentially completely aligned with. It commanded a lot of respect. At this point, it's a very low point, because Palestinians don't have that international weight in terms of behind their resistance or their organizations, their official organizations. And so the United States, of course, capitalized on that. And every step of the way, the U.S. has been funding divisions within Palestinian political parties. And it has been blackmailing Arab countries. Even if we look back in terms of normalization, we look back to the deal which was struck between Egypt and Israel. A very similar thing here. Egypt was in financial trouble. It had just undergone a war against Israel to attempt to recapture the Sinai Peninsula, which was illegally occupied. After that 73 war, the Soviets still did not pay them back. They owed them $3 billion in funds. They were attempting to secure funds from the West. And this was essentially the way that they turned away from the Soviets and went towards the United States. And the United States offered them a large amount of money. I believe the first year the deal was signed between Egypt and Israel, they received something to the tune of $3 billion in foreign aid. And up until this day, they keep the Egyptian economy essentially by the balls with this aid. And right now, even if we look at Egypt, its coup leader, Sisi, its dictator, is backed by the United States. And in terms of Jordan as well, Jordan is essentially an outpost in the Middle East, which its leadership was installed by the British, and now it acts as an outpost for the United States and the West in the Middle East, and it signed its peace deal in 1994. So in all of these cases, we see pressure on these countries. And I could go into a lot more history with Jordan and all the rest of it, but it would take a long time. And I think I've taken up a lot of your time explaining all of that stuff, because each and every single one of these
Right.
countries have a long history,
Yeah.
and the pressure has been immense.
Yeah. I want to thank Florian for the super chat. And I saw that Anthony Reyes asked a very important question. I'm trying to find it real quick. Um, where is it? So Anthony Reyes, who's a contributor to the show, he says a lot of Arab nations were Marxist friendly, and the CIA and Saudi Arabia slowly changed the ideology to Wahhabism in a lot of places. Uh, a lot of places heard him. He said he heard you talk about it briefly. So could you expand on that a little bit more? How the U.S. targets a lot of countries that are transitioning to Marxism or fully socialist country, how they see that as a threat and that they really need to intervene.
Yes, so when we're looking at the Middle East in general, a lot of Arab countries were following what could be called as, yes, a socialist
Mm-hmm.
model. They were actively working towards it. If you know of Frantz Fanon, the Algerian revolutionary writer and psychiatrist, as well by profession, he's one of those thought leaders of that revolutionary train of, you could call pan-African and pan-Arabist thought back then. So if we look at, for instance, I think that sort of train of thought started to die, and it started to shift towards sort of the Islamic ideology, whether that be a CIA co-opted Islamic resistance ideology. They call it resistance, of course. In my eyes, the CIA co-opted stuff is not resistance. It doesn't represent anybody in the Middle East. But in general, Islamic resistance, in the case of Iran, for instance, emerged after we saw the downfall of Jamal Abdel Nasser inside of Egypt. He was the Arab leader who was perhaps the most beloved, and he believed in Arab unity in a form of pan-Arabism. And in fact, at one point in time, Syria and Egypt had formed essentially unified as a single country. And the overall aim was to try and include Lebanon and Iraq in this as
Mm-hmm.
well, and essentially overcome other governments and form one Arab nation. And of course, these were leaders who had socialist ideologies. They were socialist or communist leaning many of these countries. It would take a long time to go into all of it. And the Arab nationalist movement, for instance, which was primarily headed by George Habash. George Habash was later created the PFLP, the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine, which is some of its members would be socialist, others would be communist. And to this day, that's still one of the most hated organizations by Israel in the West, because its members are known to perhaps be the most, let's say, knowledgeable on their issues. They're the most well-read in general, in terms of their membership, and a lot of them, their actions that they took were very radical against the system. But if we look at the sort of death of that ideology, that died after it started to die really in 1967 with the June 1967 war, when Israel launched its active aggression in Operation Focus, as they called it, their so-called preemptive strike, even though Jamal Abdel Nasser was not going to fire off at Israel. It started to die then. In 1967. In that Six-Day War, they wiped out Egypt's air force. They occupied the Sinai Peninsula. They occupied Gaza, the West Bank, East Jerusalem, the Golan from Syria. And in that moment, and then of course with the death of Nasser during the what you could call almost like a civil war between the Palestinian guerrilla forces and the Jordanian regime in 1970 and so forth. There was still conflict after that as well. When Jamal Abdel Nasser died, that was when that ideology started to sort of dissipate. And there's still lots of people in the Middle East that believe in this. Obviously, you've got parties which are, let's say, secular parties which are leaning towards that ideology, which still existed after that. even in the case of Saddam Hussein was secular. He was not a sectarian leader. The Ba'ath Party, of course, inside of Iraq and Syria, two different things. The Syrian government is a secular government. A lot of people would argue that it's sectarian in certain ways, but it's not set up to officially be any sort of a government which leans towards any group. It's supposed to be secular, and the country is legislated to be a secular country. But when you're looking at other countries, unfortunately, and this is where Western influence comes into it, there is the influence of Saudi Arabia. And its Salafist ideology. Originally, that ideology was actually birthed inside of Egypt. Egypt, during the French occupation of Egypt, a lot of these sort of reformist newspapers, Islamic newspapers, first formed. A lot of these thinkers came out of that era, and later on this developed. Saudi Arabia became the head of this and added to this. And of course, we had the Wahhabist ideologues, which emerged. Eventually, of course, for those who are learned to the history, during the Afghan-Soviet War, loads of these groups, which had their ideological base in Saudi Arabia and in other countries as well, but in Saudi Arabia, were financed by the likes of the CIA and the MI6, etc., and formed armed groups like Al-Qaeda, for instance, which emerged in 1988, and others, the Taliban, for instance. And the co-opting of these sort of Islamic movements and the rise of the Islamic movements fell out of a void because people had felt for a long time that the Arab nationalism and socialist movements had failed to achieve their goals, and their leaders had been defeated. And who replaced them were more religious leaders who came in. And eventually, it was all, at the time, it used to be, even during Lebanon civil war and all the rest of it, they were the leaders there. And the groups there were nationalists. It wasn't too much, it was never really to do with religion. Later on, we saw in all countries it sprung up, and it was inspired by the Iranian Revolution, the Islamic Revolution, because in the Middle East, Arabs saw the Iranians did it. The Iranians freed themselves from Western imperialism, and they did it with with an Islamic government. And so later on, we saw a lot of these Islamic movements form. So, for instance, later on, you had in 1987 in Palestine, all these years of resistance since 1948. It was in 1987 during the Intifada that Hamas emerged, which was Islamic resistance. In 1981, Palestinian Islamic Jihad emerged, right? Islamic organization. Before that, it wasn't Islamic organization. Some of them have aims of national liberation. For instance, you've got Hezbollah, which emerged out of the 1982 war that Israel waged against Lebanon, killed between 15 to 20,000 people. Hezbollah rose out of the historically poor people of South Lebanon, the downtrodden people of South Lebanon, and became a Shia organization. It came out of Shia Islamic thought. And so organizations like that are obviously distinctly different from the other co-opted groups, which are not organic and not about national liberation, but are about creating a wider Islamic state. And then you've also got groups in between, which have been there for a long time, like the Muslim Brotherhood, which many people say its founder, Banna, was originally funded by the CIA. And so they later on co-opted all of these groups. They attempted to sort of get their fingers in the pie because they realized that if all of these countries were inspired by each other and we're seeing Islamic governments throw out occupying forces, then this could be a very bad trend, especially if these Islamic governments, were friends with each other. And for instance, when you see the Iraq War, what happened in the Iraq War? For instance, in a country with little to no sectarianism under Saddam Hussein was not a good person, but Saddam Hussein was not sectarian. And so when the Americans invaded Iraq, they did some of the most horrible things to the Sunni minority in that country. And when they established a government like the government established by the French inside of Lebanon, it was a confessionalist one, which puts one sect on top of everyone else. Then on top of that, if you oppress one minority like the Americans did, and you allow Al-Qaeda to come into the country, which is a hardline sectarian group, a Sunni fundamentalist group, which wants to kill all the Shias, suddenly Al-Qaeda comes into Iraq and starts, instead of an insurgency, which was originally just against the U.S. forces, now turns it into an insurgency against Shia. Okay, and then you create a massive war there. And from that point as well of the Iraq War, we have seen sectarianism explode inside of Syria and elsewhere in the region as well. And now the co-opting of Islamic movements has worked in their favor in terms of they've been able to pit different Islamic groups against each other and to exacerbate tensions over small ideological differences we have as Muslims. You know, these are not big things that are between us in terms of ideological differences, but they try and exacerbate it. And so for a long time, they've been working on this project, and it's sad to see how it's emerged. But originally, I think that's a very key point, which a lot of people don't know. Originally, all this resistance and terrorism as well, there's bad groups that do illegitimate acts and do horrible things, of course. In the Middle East, Al-Qaeda, Daesh, or ISIS, and other groups like them are examples of this. And there are, of course, acts by national liberation movements, which we don't approve of. However, originally these groups were all nationalist. They were socialists or communists. They did not have the ideology of Islamic fundamentalism, as a lot of people would term it. And I think that if you understand that history, for a lot of people, that will completely dispel Islamophobia, because a lot of people look at the Middle East and say, oh, these crazy Islamic organizations and governments just wanting to kill Western people and all of this. And they just completely ignore the fact that there's this whole bulk of history there behind it of resistance to colonialism, and then in the post-colonial era, the resistance there as well. And freeing yourself from the shackles of empire and how that's developed. And understanding that, of course, there's a lot which can be gone through in order to sort of talk about each individual country. It takes a long time. But that there is very key in stopping, I really do believe, it stops Islamophobia if you understand the history behind everything, why organizations emerge, and the history of resistance inside of the Middle East.
Yeah. So, what do you predict will happen under the Biden administration? Do you think that things will get better or worse? We have Tony Blinken now being the successor to Mike Pompeo as Secretary of State. We also have Avril Haines as Director of National Intelligence, who was the architect of Obama's drone program. What do you predict will happen?
This is an interesting one. Obviously, to try and predict exactly what's going to happen is difficult. However, I don't have high hopes. That's in terms of specifics. I don't really have high hopes, and that is just based upon their records. I mean, if Joe Biden can get back into the JCPOA, the Iran nuclear deal, that will be a good thing. If he can undo this recent designation of Ansar Allah, the Houthis, as a terrorist organization, that will be a tremendous thing. That will avert what Trump has just done, which is essentially a move which will block aid from going into the #1 humanitarian crisis on the planet, according to the United Nations. And there's a number of different things. I mean, in terms of what he's going to do with Palestine, I'd say little to nothing. There might be light condemnation of settlements, won't do anything. I doubt he'll do anything. If Israel wants to go and bombard Gaza, I doubt he'll do anything. But I don't think he'll make the moves like Trump did. I don't think he'll go as far as Trump did. I don't think he'll be as aggressive against Iran. However, there's prospects there for him to be more aggressive in Syria, for instance. That's completely on the table. It depends what approach they want to take to Syria. Because they're still there. And of course, in Iraq as well. Joe Biden is one of the original drafters of a plan to reinvade Iraq, essentially. And according to Syrian intelligence reports, which I received last year, it was actually on the table. that another invasion of Iraq. So that was still there. Whether they'll actually do that, I don't know whether they'll actually do it or not. I can't really say. Also, if he's going to engage in another war, um, well, first of all, he would have to get back in these Russian nuclear weapons treaties or missile treaties in order to avert some sort of like a scare of nuclear war, for one, if he's going to do anything good. And if he does that, then that's a good thing. And also, I believe if he's going to go for wars, the wars that he could go for that come to mind, which would be the most obvious, would be if he tried to start a proxy war against Iran, funding Azeri organizations in order to try and take over land inside of Iran, and basically use them as foot soldiers. And I mean, that's a possibility. It is a big possibility. And what just happened between Armenia and Azerbaijan really does factor into this. So that's a threat there. Possibly they could go for that tactic of trying to create a proxy war. And that's a big problem if they do go for that, because the population of Azeris inside of Iran is approximately 20 million. If they can just get 1% of that population, then you've got about 200,000 militants which are ready to go, if they can effectively arm them somehow. So that's a potential for a huge war there. I don't believe it will be a direct war if they were going to do it. But if he gets in the nuclear deal and everything goes well, then that would be good. And Venezuela is another one which I still see as on the table in terms of regime change war. I believe that they would possibly try and do that. And maybe they would try and even use the excuse that, for instance, like we had the Cuban missile crisis, they could use a similar thing if they don't get back into those missile treaties, that perhaps Russia or maybe China are attempting to place in missiles, nuclear missiles in Venezuela or something like this, some pretext. They can come up with something. And so there's a number of wars which are already there for him. I haven't seen him say anything about to indicate that he'll get out of Yemen, that he'll withdraw the troops from Iraq, that he'll in any way prevent Israel from doing anything bad, that he'll withdraw from Syria, Afghanistan, or at least down like the drone strikes, which in 2019 killed 700 people, civilians. I don't see any hopes for him being too much better, but I don't think he'll be as extreme on Iran. I can't see him being as extreme, at least not in rhetoric. And on the Palestinian issue, I think Trump is significantly worse. Trump was significantly worse. But again, it's like, what do you want, neoconservatism or neoliberalism? And both of them, they're both war hawks. They don't care about the people. And in my eyes, they're insane racists. And this is something I can't stress enough, is that they do not view the lives of anyone in the global South as equal to American lives. Not that they really care about most American lives anyway, but they do not give a damn. They view these people as savages, and that's why they are propagandizing you and trying to manufacture your consent to go to war against these people. And it's always about Iran bad, Iran bad, Iran bad, or the Arabs did this and the Muslims. And that's the message they push. And when it comes to the Muslims now, they've actually had a transition with the neoliberals. Now they'll tell me that they like me as a Muslim, right? But if I have political thought as a Muslim, I'm a terrorist. So hey, like you can't win with this one. Right. It's an interesting thing, pick between a bad bunch. I can't see anything great coming out of this. But again, the Iran nuclear deal, reversing the Ansarullah resignation as a terrorist organization, that would be a start. If he can do those two things, then he's significantly better than Trump in my eyes.
Yeah, and Trump did a lot to exacerbate the situation. Like, he laid the groundworks there for Biden with his relationship with Iran. And also, let's not also forget how Biden said that he's a Zionist. He's like, I don't have to be a Jew to be a Zionist. So I really hope things get better, but I think that the relationships with Israel will still stay there. But again, it's just like every administration is like building from the previous administration. I did. I don't know, man. The best thing we can do is just keep informing ourselves and telling people to check out journalists like yourself, who's doing a lot of great work. Do you have time for one more question?
For sure, shoot it, man.
Yeah, the last question I have, I want to give a shout out to a contributor of the show, Fuzz the Fair. There's a bill that was introduced in the U.S. House in November called H.R. 8733. I don't know if you heard of this one. It's the United States Israel Common Defense Authorization Act. And its goal is to authorize the president to take action to ensure Israel is prepared for all contingencies if Iran seeks to develop a nuclear weapon and for other purposes. So it is trying to gain authoritative power to prevent Iran from developing a nuclear weapon. As far as I know, Iran has no plans of creating a nuclear weapon. Iran's top nuclear scientist, Mohsen Fakhrizadeh, was just assassinated in November by Israel with no legal consequences. So this bill was written around that time. Can you tell us more about whether the U.S. and Israel are creating this narrative that Iran is a threat to Israel? Is this true? Like, is Iran actually a threat to Israel? And aren't we here in the U.S. already contributing a lot with like our taxpayer dollars and already arming Israel enough? And also, isn't Israel the only country in that region that's armed with nuclear weapons?
Well, it's certainly, I mean, we could include, if we include Pakistan as in the Middle East, then I suppose. But in terms of the country in the Middle East which has nuclear weapons and is not telling anybody that it has nuclear weapons and has not signed the Non-Proliferation Treaty, that's Israel. Yeah, of course. And the estimates are that it has approximately around 300 nuclear weapons. And of course, again, it goes to this sort of Orientalist way of viewing the world, that we think that it's all right for Israel to have nuclear weapons and not to even declare them and not sign the treaty. And Iran is the threat somehow, is Iran can't have them. Iran are so irrational. Oh, these crazy Muslims, these crazy Iranians and Arabs, oh, they're just, you can't trust them with anything because they're just so crazy and irrational that they cannot have nuclear weapons. To me, that's just completely, it's a racist way of viewing it. Of course, again, we never hear this, portrayed in this way, and that's just what it is. In terms of whether Iran presents a threat to Israel, of course it can. It can. If it's attacked, like it was attacked, and there was a international act of terrorism committed on their own soil in Tehran when they killed Mohsen Fakhrizadeh, then yeah, like they can respond, and in that way they could pose a threat. I mean, like any country in the region, when they're attacked, can pose a threat. And Iran, of course, funds Hezbollah. It funds Hamas and Palestinian Islamic Jihad and other organizations. But these organizations, unless if Israel completely backed off and Israel weren't attacking them, they would have no reason to attack. They exist because of Israel, for one, attacking and occupying their lands, and their national liberation movements. And if it wasn't for a group like, for instance, Hezbollah, then half of Lebanon, maybe all of Lebanon, would be occupied by Israel at this point. So when we're looking at that, oh yes, it backs groups in the Middle East which pose a threat to Israel. But it's not like Israel is just sitting there minding its own business, and not doing anything. If that was the case, then I would say absolutely Iran needs to be punished for backing these groups. These groups are groups which are not just fighting as well. These groups, for instance, in the Gaza Strip, Hamas, they're both considered, Hamas, Islamic Jihad, and Hezbollah are considered as terrorist organizations. But we never get the differentiation between these groups and Al-Qaeda and Daesh, completely different groups, for instance. They don't replicate each other in any way whatsoever, but they're all terrorists and they're all the same thing, which again feeds into our misunderstanding that we have in the West of these groups and what they are and what their function is. And so when we're looking at these groups, Hamas was democratically elected inside of the Gaza Strip, and Hezbollah is part of the Lebanese political system. And they also, both of these organizations started off as organizations, parties which would essentially help feed people as charities. That's how these organizations started originally. And so Iran was there. I mean, there's a newer relationship when it comes to Hamas. But that's what they mean when they say Iran presents a threat. They know
Mm-hmm.
full well that Iran, in terms of its nuclear weapons, it doesn't have any. It doesn't want to pursue them. Well, at least it's not stated that it wants to. There's no evidence that it wants to pursue them. And there is no evidence, according to every single legitimate international body, that it has a nuclear weapons program. It doesn't
Mm-hmm.
exist. There is no nuclear weapons program. And the thing is, as well, and I discussed this with you earlier on
Mm-hmm.
before the broadcast here, that if Iran had a nuclear weapon or was secretly developing a nuclear weapon, it could have got a nuclear weapon by now. I mean, it's in a country. They're not just a
Mm-hmm.
bunch of cavemen like some people in the West might imagine. This is an extremely advanced country.
Mm-hmm.
Its ballistic missiles, which it displays to the entire world and does massive demonstrations of the power of their ballistic missiles, which, by the way, you can, of course, load a nuclear explosive onto a nuclear device onto there if you wanted to, if you had one. These ballistic missiles are extremely precise,
Mm-hmm.
like to a point where a lot of these ballistic missiles are more precise than American ones, because of course American ones would just have the nuclear payload, and so they don't have to get too close to their target, whereas the Iranians want to get closer to their target. That's their aim of them. And so the Iranians, if they had a nuclear weapon, for instance, and they were hiding all of this stuff, Iran could use that as a form of blackmail against them. Say, look, we're going to get it. We're this close, right? Or if they had a nuclear weapon, they could say, look, we have a nuclear weapon, back off. Get into a deal with us or we're going to do that. But they don't do that. They don't fret to do that. And it would be the best thing for them. And Netanyahu, by the way, who's always behind, doing everything possible against Iran, and these hardline neoconservatives have been crying this for the past 20, 30 years, that Iran is going to get its since the Islamic Revolution, essentially. There has been these hardline right wingers claiming that Iran is moving towards a nuclear weapon, and
Mm-hmm.
Netanyahu, at least 15 years, you can track it back to him claiming that next week or in 2 years or in 1 year, Iran's going to have a nuclear weapon. Iran backs organizations in the Middle East which are opposed to Israel. But even in terms of these organizations that it backs, or governments that it backs inside of the Middle East, they don't just exist because they're crazy terrorists that just want to kill Israelis for no reason.
Mm-hmm.
They're there because they're a legitimate resistance force or government which is elected by the people. Like that's and the reason, like, this is the thing, the reason why these organizations exist is because people support them still. Why would they support them? Because they're resisting. That's what they feel, because these people have been bombed into oblivion. They have been starved. They've had their lands occupied, and they're pissed off, and they want to resist and kick them out. And in the case of, for instance, Lebanon, the Lebanese Hezbollah were the reason why Israel was kicked out of Lebanon. And Iran backs that. So these things, you could say, look, Iran poses a threat there. If you attack Iran, like any country on earth, they're going to attack you back. But
Mm-hmm.
it's not the way they portray all of these horrible Muslims that are just
Mm-hmm.
surrounding Israel. It's like, well, like that narrative, oh, it's in a bad neighborhood. You want to even, they always say that, all these Arab countries and these Muslim countries around. It's like, okay, to your south, Egypt, completely on your side, right? If you look towards the east, there's Jordan, which is completely on its side. It occupies land from both of the countries at its north, Syria and Lebanon.
Mm-hmm.
It occupies their land, the Sheba Farms and the Jolan Heights. Okay, that's why they're angry. Their lands are occupied. That's why. And because of the historic aggression against them. In terms of a lot of these other Arab countries as well, these reactionary Arab regimes, they're in favor of Israel. They're working with Israel. And this whole argument, it's before it was, we're in a bad neighborhood and they're all
Mm-hmm.
threatening our destruction, and we're going to be killed by all of the Arabs. Now it's, oh, Iran, and it backs a few militant groups in countries who are nationalist, national liberation Islamic movements. And it's just a weak argument, and it's an argument which is meant to deceive you, and it's a very basic summary of events there. And again, it comes down to how stupid they think that Middle East that the American public or the British public, etc., are so stupid that they don't need to be told the full facts. This is just the
Hmm.
propaganda we need to hand you, and they'll just give you these stupid lines. And that's what's led to Mike Pompeo coming out with the same thing that, for instance, the Bush administration came out with against Saddam Hussein, claiming that Iran is somehow linked to Al Qaeda. The dumbest thing you could ever claim. The dumbest thing. It doesn't make any sense on any level. But you might as well claim that the Pope is now linked with Al Qaeda as well,
Hmm.
and the home base is the Vatican, and they're
Yeah.
all there. It makes just as much sense. But it's a sad state of affairs that we're in, and people's lack of understanding has led to this,
Hmm.
and a lot of the anger and hatred that we see against people in the region.
Yeah. Also, isn't it Iran's business if they want to make nuclear programs? Like, why does the U.S. have to like decide who does and who doesn't get to have nuclear weapons? Like, did it like were there countries that were deciding whether the U.S. could make nuclear weapons? Right?
Yeah, exactly. Like it's like this is this whole thing of basically like I'm white and I say so. Like that's basically
Yeah.
what it is. Like that's how I see it, honestly. It's just like, well, like we're the big Western countries with our
We know
superior
better.
values. We know better. Yeah, and it's Orientalism 101 with these people. Like it's with this whole thing, it's like you can't do this, but it's like, oh, Iran's so dangerous if they had a nuclear weapon. It's like, okay, that like they're going to be so dangerous if they have a nuclear weapon. What is the one country on earth which has used it
I
against a
know.
civilian population? And on top of that, look at what they did in somewhere like the Marshall Islands, for instance, with testing their nuclear weapons there and calling the people savages, which they were testing it on, essentially in these islands, and then sent these native people back to their islands to go and basically be exposed to this nuclear fallout. And then up until this day in the Marshall Islands, they essentially have apartheid set up there. And they're lecturing us so that they can have their nuclear missile base, so it's within the range to go and bomb China. And these people are the people that are telling with the bases all over the world, which can reach any country at any time, which can threaten any country at any time and can hit with nuclear weapons any country, is a country that gets to lecture other
Yeah.
countries on whether they should have nuclear weapons. It's hilarious.
It's absolutely ridiculous, and it's like, oh, so Israel has nuclear weapons. Why don't we make the same argument? Oh, how come we don't call them dangerous? Oh, you can't say that. That's anti-Semitic. You can't say that about Israel. Any criticism you make about Israel is anti-Semitic, even if it's like an objective fact, or if you're pointing out hypocrisy.
Yeah, it's ridiculous, and I think, to be honest, like that's the only thing you have left is you have to try and smear and discredit the messenger, because the message, they can't beat someone who knows their facts on this issue. They can't. Like on the issue of Israel Palestine, if there's somebody that's knowledgeable, they can't debate you, these Zionists, because at the end of the day, it's like a racist trying to explain to you why it is rational that they should have slavery. Okay, it's like somebody trying to explain to you
Yeah.
from a rational perspective and using human rights. Okay, this is literally the comparison here, and this is what the South Africans would do as well. Yes, well, there's a reason why we have this in place, and it's like, and they try to use human rights and they try to use the values, like liberal values, okay, in order to discuss these issues, and it's like, no, no, I'm sorry, that you cannot use those values to discuss it, because it's an irrational, racist hatred that you have. You're colonizing people, and this is based upon ethnic groups. So when you turn around and say that it's anti-Semitism, I mean, look, there are real anti-Semites out
Yeah.
there, and
Hmm.
calling somebody that's calling for Palestinian human rights an anti-Semite is just delegitimizing. Like it's just basically it's lumping in all those people with the real anti-Semites, and it's also it's making it so that real anti-Semitism is being ignored, because a lot of people just hear, oh, such and such is an anti-Semite, and it's like everyone's getting called an anti-Semite for literally calling out Israeli policy, and like, that's the only thing that a lot of people are doing to get called an anti-Semite. So there is real anti-Semitism. There's real like white supremacists who hate Jewish people for just being Jewish. They
Mm-hmm.
exist. They are nothing to do with people who care about Palestinian human rights, and you can differentiate between the two very quickly. You come to understand what the two are. So it's sad that that claim comes up every single time. But again, it's like arguing with a white supremacist,
Mm-hmm.
and then they turn around and say you're against the white man. All right, or like I equate it to that. It's like that's your argument. Like
Yeah.
I'm arguing against apartheid, I'm arguing against slavery, and you're saying that I'm anti-white. That's what you're saying? I mean, that makes no sense to me. Like,
It,
come
it's
on.
it's by design too, the way they indoctrinate us from birth, like from elementary school. And like they why don't they teach us how modern and how advanced Iran is, and how they have they're advanced in so many things, like their cult, they don't teach us this stuff. And so they create this caricature for us to be afraid of them and to think that they're savages so that they can more easily manufacture our consent. They want us to be ignorant about our foreign policy. They don't want us to know about journalists like you, Robert. So where can people find your work? Like I know you're in the Last American Vagabond. Where else can people find your work? You have a YouTube channel, so you want to give any shout outs?
Um, yeah, my YouTube channel, of course, I update a lot on what's going on pretty much every single day in Palestine. I bring some of the worst things that are happening each day in Palestine on my Twitter. I have a Facebook. I've transitioned off that a little bit because, like, obviously there's quite a bit of the censorship there, unfortunately now. I work for Press TV and I work for Quds News. Quds News is a Palestinian media outlet. Also I work there, so my work will be found on both of their websites, on Press TV, the television channel as well. My works are there. And yeah.
Yeah, definitely check out Robert Inlakesh. People subscribe to his channel, read his articles, where you can find them at the Last American Vagabond. And thank you guys all so much for watching. I love you guys, and don't forget to stay informed.